James Carter was a man who had seen war, but he never expected the real battle to happen in his own backyard. One evening he caught two men trespassing on his property, claiming to be HOA compliance officers. They inspected his home like they owned it, issuing bogus violations and warning him that he was in trouble. The problem? James didn't have an HOA. When he demanded answers, the older man, smug and sure of himself, chuckled. "Sir, we make the rules around here. You'd be wise to cooperate." That was their first mistake, because what these con men didn't know was that James wasn't some clueless homeowner. He was a retired Marine, trained to spot deception, built to withstand intimidation. And when they pushed too far, when they broke into his house, James didn't just fight back. He buried them. By the time the dust settled, their entire scam had unraveled. Police were in cuffs, and James had exposed a fraudulent operation that had terrorized homeowners for years. But let's start at the beginning. James Carter had seen his fair share of trouble. As a retired Marine, he'd survived 2 combat tours, learned discipline, resilience, and, most importantly, how to recognize a threat before it became one. But nothing in his years of service prepared him for the absurdity about to unfold in his own backyard. It was a warm evening, the kind that made the grill a necessity rather than an option. James stood on his patio, flipping a perfectly seared steak, enjoying the peaceful quiet of his suburban neighborhood, until he saw them. 2 men, both wearing reflective vests, tactical-looking boots, and carrying clipboards, walked casually across his backyard, inspecting his fence, peering at his shed, even taking pictures of his house. His gut reaction? Intruders. But their cocky, deliberate movements told him otherwise. These weren't burglars. These were men who thought they had authority. James stepped off his deck, his voice sharp. "Excuse me, can I help you?" The older man, burly with a thick mustache, turned to him with a smirk, as if James was the intruder on his own land. "Sir, we're with the HOA Compliance Board. We've had multiple reports of violations on your property. We're here to conduct an inspection." James narrowed his eyes. "I don't have an HOA." The mustached man flipped through his clipboard, unfazed. "Actually, the Stonebrook Community Enhancement Association recently expanded its jurisdiction. Your property falls under our oversight now. We're just making sure everything's up to code." James had dealt with enough bureaucratic nonsense in the military to recognize when someone was trying to bluff him. His jaw tightened. "No, you're not. This property was never part of an HOA, and I never signed any agreement. That means you're trespassing." The second man, younger and thinner, squared his shoulders like he'd just been challenged. "Sir, we have the authority to inspect properties under the new community regulations." James folded his arms. "Show me the legal documentation proving that." He let the words hang for a second, then added, "If you don't have it, I suggest you get off my property before I call the real cops." The older man chuckled, shaking his head. "No need to get aggressive, sir. We'll be back." James didn't flinch. He simply pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of them as they turned and walked away. That night, he did some digging. No record of any HOA expansion, no legal backing for their so-called compliance checks, which meant one thing: these guys were bluffing, or worse. And James wasn't about to let it slide. James pulled into his driveway just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The golden light cast long shadows across his front yard, but something felt off. A feeling deep in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive in combat, told him something was wrong. Then he saw it. His front door was slightly ajar. His grip on the keys tightened. He stepped out of his truck, every movement controlled. Years of training took over as he approached the entrance, scanning for any signs of forced entry. The lock wasn't broken, but the door had definitely been pushed open. His pulse steady, James eased inside, his sharp eyes darting over every detail. Living room, untouched. Kitchen, normal. But when he reached his office, that's when the feeling in his gut turned into cold certainty. His desk drawers were ajar, papers slightly shuffled. His filing cabinet had been disturbed. Someone had been searching. For what? A flicker of movement through the window caught his attention. James turned, and there they were. The same two men from before, now standing in his backyard like they owned the place. Only this time, they weren't just casually inspecting his fence. They had walkie-talkies and utility belts. His blood boiled. This wasn't just some nuisance anymore. This was an invasion. Without hesitation, James stepped onto the patio, his voice sharp and controlled. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The older man, the one with the mustache, barely looked surprised. In fact, he smirked. "Sir, we had reason to believe you were violating HOA security regulations. We're conducting a routine compliance check." James clenched his jaw. His patience was gone. He took another step forward, his voice like steel. "I told you once, I don't have an HOA, and now you've broken into my home. That's illegal." The younger guy, who had been standing stiffly, shifted uneasily. He opened his mouth to speak, but James cut him off. "Cut the crap." His voice was low but full of authority. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone and snapping another picture of the two. "Who are you really? Because from where I'm standing, you're just two guys playing fake cop in an HOA that doesn't exist." That got their attention. The mustached man's smirk disappeared. His face darkened. "You don't want to make this difficult, Mr. Carter." James let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Buddy, you just broke into my house. Trust me, you picked difficult." And with that, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911 on speaker. The second the dispatcher answered, the two men bolted, pushing past each other as they rushed off his property. James could have chased them, but he didn't need to. He had everything he needed to bury them. The flashing red and blue lights lit up James's front yard as two patrol cars pulled up. Officers stepped out, scanning the area with professional precision. James stood on his porch, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He'd dealt with high-stakes situations before, but there was something particularly infuriating about having his own home violated. A tall officer with a buzz cut approached first. "Sir, you reported a break-in?" James nodded, his voice firm. "Not just that. These two men have been harassing me, claiming to be part of an HOA that doesn't exist. I caught them trespassing before, and now I come home to find my door open and them snooping around my property." He handed the officer his phone. "I got photos of them, and I want them arrested." The officer studied the images, his expression shifting as he scrolled through. "All right, let's take this step by step. You mentioned the door was open. Was anything taken?" James shook his head. "Doesn't look like it, but they were in my office. My filing cabinet was disturbed. Someone was looking for something." Another officer, a stocky guy with graying hair, walked over. "We'll do a sweep of the house, check for prints. Meanwhile, I'll run a check on these guys." He turned to his partner, lowering his voice. "HOA fraud's been popping up a lot lately." James watched as one of the officers called something in over the radio. He could see it on their faces. This wasn't just some neighborhood dispute. There was more to this. Minutes passed before the radio crackled back with a response. The stocky officer's brows furrowed as he listened, then turned to James. "There's no Stonebrook Community Enhancement Association registered with the city." James clenched his jaw. He knew it. No legal authority, no records. So what does that mean? The officer exhaled, shaking his head. Means they're running a scam, and not a small one. James felt a surge of vindication. "Go on." "These guys aren't inspectors. They aren't even residents of this neighborhood." The officer looked him dead in the eye. "They've been targeting homeowners in the area, pretending to be part of an HOA, slapping fake fines on people, bullying them into compliance. Some folks just pay up, thinking it's legitimate. James let out a low, humorless chuckle. So they try to shake down the wrong guy, and now what? They get to just walk? Not this time. The officer held up James's phone. You gave us photos, timestamps, a report of a break-in. That's enough to get a warrant. He turned to his partner. We need to find these guys, now. Within 24 hours, law enforcement had them in custody. Both men had extensive rap sheets: fraud, trespassing, harassment. James's case was the one that sealed their fate. They had picked the wrong house, and now they were going to pay. The tension in the courtroom was thick. Every eye in the room was fixed on the judge, waiting for the verdict that would decide the fate of the so-called HOA officers. James sat in the front row, his expression calm, but his mind razor-sharp. He had spent his life standing against threats, on the battlefield, and now in his own backyard. He had fought for his country, and now he had fought for his home. These two frauds thought they could intimidate him like they had so many others. They had made a very big mistake. Across the aisle, the two men sat at the defendant's table, their postures stiff, their confidence gone. The mustached man, who had once smirked in James's yard, now looked pale and uneasy. His younger accomplice fidgeted with his fingers, staring at the table as if he could will himself invisible. The prosecution had left no room for doubt. They laid out everything. The trespassing, backed by James's clear photographs. The fraudulent inspections, where they pressured homeowners into compliance. The attempted extortion, tricking residents into paying bogus fines. And worst of all, the break-in at James's home. But the real bombshell came when law enforcement revealed the full extent of their operation. This wasn't just a one-time scam. These men had been running their con for years. They had built an entire fake HOA from the ground up, creating fraudulent documents, issuing illegitimate fines, and bullying homeowners into paying thousands in fake penalties. They forged letters, made up legal jargon, and even set up fake hearings where homeowners were pressured into writing checks just to avoid legal trouble that never actually existed. Some victims had drained their savings trying to clear their HOA debts. Others had been pushed to sell their homes, believing they had no other option. Families had lost everything because of these two crooks. James clenched his fists. It was worse than he thought. The defense tried their best to spin it. They were just trying to keep the neighborhood in order. It was a misunderstanding. They never intended to hurt anyone. Bullshit. The judge didn't buy a word of it. The courtroom was dead silent when the verdict was read. Guilty, on all counts. Trespassing, fraud, breaking and entering, identity theft, criminal harassment. The list went on, and James made sure to watch their faces every second of it. The mustached man closed his eyes and exhaled, shoulders sagging. The younger one swallowed hard, gripping the table. They both knew they were finished. And then, the sentence: fines, restitution, prison time. James exhaled slowly, a wave of satisfaction washing over him. But he wasn't done yet. He had one more move to make. A personal lawsuit, and another victory. Winning in criminal court was one thing, but James wanted to make sure these men paid personally. So he sued them in civil court. He wanted them to feel what it was like to have everything ripped away, the same way they had done to their victims. He demanded damages, not just for himself, but for every homeowner they had scammed. And once again, he won. The judge ordered the two men to pay massive restitution, draining whatever assets they had left. Every stolen dollar was accounted for. Every victim was compensated. And the final, crushing blow, the mustached man's own house was seized to help pay the settlement. James didn't just beat them, he destroyed them, ensuring it never happened again. But James wasn't the kind of man to celebrate and move on. He took steps to make sure no one ever tried to pull something like this again. First, he installed real security cameras, covering every inch of his property. If anyone so much as set foot where they shouldn't, he'd know about it instantly. Next, he filed a no trespass order against any individual or organization attempting to enforce fake HOA rules. The next fraud who showed up at his doorstep would be leaving in the back of a police car. But most importantly, James made sure every neighbor knew their rights. He went door to door, talking to homeowners, sharing his story. He handed out pamphlets, connected people with legal resources, and exposed the full scope of the scam. He even got the local news involved, making sure the entire county knew about the fraud and how to protect themselves. The fake HOA scam died that day, not just because of the arrests, but because James had made sure that no one would ever fall for it again. So, the next time someone knocked on a door claiming to be from the HOA, they wouldn't be leaving without a pair of handcuffs. The final lesson. James sat on his back patio one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His home was finally his again, secure, safe, and untouchable. The fight had been exhausting, but worth it. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about him. It was about every homeowner who had ever been bullied, scammed, or tricked into believing they didn't have control over their own property. Moral of the story? Know your rights, stand your ground, and never ever let someone tell you they own what's yours, because they just might pick the wrong guy to mess with.